And it's time. Okay, so I'll tell you when I'm going to start it here. So I am starting, and it looks like we are live. Okay, thank you everybody for taking the time to join me today. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the chat here. Just want to make sure that I can see it. In case anybody has any questions or anything that they want to give me some feedback on. Stefan, thanks for joining. Really appreciate it. So the reason for today's YouTube Live is that I actually called Canon Pro Support and I asked some specific questions regarding the Canon raw light workflow when you're shooting on the Canon C200. And I got an interesting response from the Canon Pro Support rep, which is totally understandable. And I'm going to be actually publishing that entire phone call. I'm going to speed up through while I'm on hold portions of it, but I do want you guys to have sort of an understanding of where Canon is at today with distributing their information, and then also share with you what it is that they said so that you guys can begin to make some more educated decisions about how you finalize or establish your workflow when you're shooting on the Canon C200 in RAW. So before I get into the phone call, I want to make a couple of clarifications. So the first clarification is I saw a comment yesterday where someone said, I thought you didn't like the Canon C200. And that couldn't be further from the truth. I really do like that camera. I like what that camera is capable of. I like what that camera is able to shoot. I like the images that it's able to produce. I do have some challenges with the camera, and they're mainly based on the limitations of the RAW workflow when you're processing your RAW through the Canon RAW development software. But the camera itself and what the camera is able to accomplish, I am very happy with. If there was one thing that I could change about the Canon C200, it would simply be for it to have 2 CFast 2.0 card slots so that I could record for an extended period of time in RAW without stopping the production. But beyond that, I don't really have any gripes. Now, I realize that when you're shooting MP4, it's an 8-bit codec. And there are going to be several people who do not like the fact that it's only 8-bit when you're shooting MP4. To that, for me, one, it's not an issue because I own a Canon C200 Mark II. So when I am shooting for broadcast, I have a tool that allows me to do that. And I don't have to shoot RAW to be able to do a quick turnaround and quick delivery. The other thing I want to say is that there are thousands of people who have been shooting using 8-bit with other cameras like the GH4 or the GH3 or the GH5 before it got 10-bit, right? 10-bit that actually works with the right amount of megabits per second that actually allows it to take advantage of the 10-bit color. Sony cameras like the A series, A7, A7S, A7R, and they were shooting 4K 8-bit without any challenges. So I don't believe that the majority of those people have a real issue or complaint when it comes to the Canon C200. I do believe that some of the people who were shooting on other cinema cameras or shooting on cameras that can support broadcast would want these different broadcast related features on the C200. I'm not one of them. I own a C300 Mark II and I own a Red. So I'm not in that boat. For what the Canon C200 is and what the C200 has to offer, it is a tremendous, tremendous tool. And Canon has really done a great job at giving people who might have been shooting on DSLRs the opportunity to step up into the cinema line and take advantage of 10 or 12-bit RAW so that they could shoot some of their other projects, like maybe music videos or indie films or other types of shorts that would, merit using up all of that extra data. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty with what the Canon Pro Support rep basically told me. So I had a laundry list of questions, and I'm going to share here with you a document. So I had a whole bunch of questions, like what color space am I using when I shoot RAW? Does the color space get baked in? What do you recommend for an existing workflow for today's version of RAW? And there are a lot of other different questions, like which LUT is the appropriate LUT, and when and what other different software is going to support the RAW development. The short version of what happened is that this is a brand new product that basically started shipping here within the last couple of weeks. The Canon rep that I spoke to was only aware of the B version, so the C200B, actually shipping. He didn't know that the regular or the other version that includes the touchscreen was already shipping. He asked me how did I get a hold of it, and as I told you guys in my initial Canon C200 video in this series, I rented it. I rented it with my own cash from Lens Pro to Go. So I explained that to him. And again, the short of it is that Canon has scheduled training for their Canon Pro Support reps, which has not at this point happened yet. So the information that he has access to is essentially the same information that you and I have access to, which is mainly Google and the owner's manual. Now, with the understanding that there may have been plans for software like Final Cut Pro X to support the RAW development at the time of launch, that has not been the case. Currently, the only third-party software outside of Canon that supports the RAW workflow is Resolve. And one thing that I said in a previous video, but somehow got lost in translation, was the fact that while I believe that was a better workflow, a faster workflow, a faster way to process my RAW image, when you are working with Canon RAW Lite and you choose to bypass the Canon RAW development software and you are trying to process your RAW clips in Resolve, you do not have any access whatsoever to change the RAW settings in the clip. The only way to change things like white balance, brightness, white balance shift, assign a color space, and assign a gamma is to do it using the Canon RAW development software. If you bypass that, you're essentially working with a RAW file. This leads me to another thing that I said earlier. So I mentioned, and I have a video saying that this is a better workflow and using Resolve. So when I take a RAW clip and I put it in Resolve and then I apply a LUT to it, I have not assigned a white balance. I've also not assigned a color space for that LUT to be working in, and I have not assigned gamma, so a gamma curve for that signal to be interpreted. That is why, if you guys go back and see my video, and I'll be sure to link to it so that you guys can reference it, that is why when I applied the LUT with what I shot in camera, I had to then make additional adjustments to bring back my highlights so that I don't clip them, and lift my shadows so that I wouldn't crush them. If I had first processed my clip using the Canon RAW development software, and I had assigned a color space of cinema gamut, which is what I had done in camera, and then assigned a gamma of Canon Log 3 or Canon Log 2 according to the Canon Pro Support rep, which I have not had success with that, but he's telling me it is possible. So if I assign those and then render them out as ProRes 4444 or whatever other options might be there, then at that point, I'm able to apply the LUT, and the LUT should not clip the highlights and not crush the shadows. So that is key. That was a very good piece of information that I got out of that phone call with Canon Pro Support. Because what I had suggested to everyone earlier was to simply process your RAW using Resolve, except when you do that, we're bypassing the assignment of the color space, and we're also bypassing the gamma curve that we want to work in. So that would make it less accurate when it's rendering the colors. So the upside and the good news for someone like me who was erroneously thinking that this was potentially a better workflow is that what I consider to be great images can only get better. Because when you make RAW adjustments and then export them, it is actually remapping the entire tonal curve. So you get cleaner whites, cleaner shadows, cleaner everything, crisp, more brilliant colors. So more color information essentially is being transferred over. So that's the good news. The bad news is that the step I thought I was saving, I now need to reapply it, and I can't save that time. So, you know, it's not all bad in that you end up with a better picture. I did ask about making intelligent decisions when I'm developing the RAW, like, for example, adjusting the brightness. And he said, so you're saying you'd like to see a histogram in there? And I said, that would be ideal. And he said, well, yeah, that would make sense, but I don't have that answer for you today. So the other thing that I asked was, because it's not called the same thing, right? And in the previous video, I complained about it, saying you can adjust brightness. Except in camera, there's no such setting. There's only ISO or gain, whichever you're choosing to shoot in. So I said, am I effectively adjusting my gain or my ISO when I move that slider around? And he said, no. Whatever ISO or gain setting you chose to shoot at in camera, that is baked in. That is not something that can be adjusted in RAW. And we talked about several other things, but those are the two big key points. I will be, like I said, publishing the full conversation, which I recorded, and that should be available to you guys by tomorrow or sometime tomorrow. So we have a question, and I'm going to get to this.
Not a question, but Ken for the win said he got a C200B yesterday and he's loving it so far.
Yeah, Ken, thank you for joining me again, Ken for the win. Really appreciate it. You're a rock star. You've been, I believe, every single one of my YouTube lives at this point. And yes, you're right. There is very little not to like about this camera. I mean, that camera has so much packed into it at a price point that, you know, frankly, it's very difficult to compete in. In fact, there was another comment on one of my YouTube videos that said, well, the Blackmagic Ursa cameras seem to check off most of those boxes. And my response is simple. Yes, that is true if you are willing on working with ISO 800 or lower. And yes, that is true if you're willing on trading off these little tiny batteries for V-mount batteries. if you don't have to do gimbal work. And yeah, I guess those are the biggest key points. So the Ursa cameras have their place in the market. I believe that the Canon C200 is going to be wildly successful. And I'm going to drop an announcement, not that anybody really here cares, but I will be replacing our GH5s with C200s.
Stefan is crying.
Sorry, the GH5s have to go. The color space, the skin tones, how quickly and how nice they look right out of the camera, it's a huge deal. Anything that saves time essentially saves me money and saves the company money. And also, in case you guys don't know, of course, I have a lot of Canon lenses and other Canon cameras, and matching Canon to Canon cameras when they're all shooting C-Log is super easy. So yeah, beyond this, there is one other thing. So the Canon rep did send me, and I'll share here with you. I'm going to switch over. He replied to me with some of his findings. So basically, he had to go back and do some research to get some answers to me, because it didn't make a lot of sense that I can't see any of my metadata when I bring in my raw clips to get them developed. And his response was to this link in an article, which happens to be by a senior pro person at Canon who has been working exclusively with the C200 for some time. So I'll be sure to link to this article in the notes of this video so that you guys have access to it. But essentially, the reason why Canon is going to be releasing an MXF version of the codec that can then be used to capture both Ultra HD or Cinema 4K in camera is so that they can write all of that metadata information into that MXF file, just like they do on the C300, on the C300 Mark II, and on several of their other cameras that use the MXF wrapper for their capture.
So
We got a question.
Ruger Production says, thanks for the info. Would love to have a denoiser in addition to the histogram. I shot raw 6400 ISO and it's extremely noisy, but you have to overexpose so you can get rid of those noise in the LEC.
Sure. So the comment is about there was a clip that was shot at ISO 6400 that came back really noisy, and so here's the challenge. First off, I don't know, were you shooting MP4 or were you shooting RAW? Because when you're shooting RAW and you actually process the clips, when you assign, say, a cinema gamut as the color space, and then you assign, say, Canon Log 3, I found that I could push it to ISO 6400 without any challenges. When my image fell apart and I completely hated it was when I chose to process in Cinema Gamut for the color space and Canon Log 2. And I realized that that was supposed to be something that you are able to do. But from my experience in all of the clips that I have, every time I've done it, it's fallen apart. So I'm not sure what that right answer is, but Canon did specify that you should be exposing at 40% IRE for your middle gray when you're shooting in C-Log. So overexposing, I'm going to tell you, even my Canon C300, I like to overexpose by half a stop, and I get better tones across skin tones and across, shadow information. And of course, the one thing you have to do is make sure that you don't clip the highlights. I will say this too, though. Clipping the highlights on the Canon C200 when shooting in RAW, to me, seemed like it was very difficult to do. And that's very different than any other Canon camera that I've shot with in the past. So yeah, that is basically it. There was one other thing that the Canon Pro rep mentioned, and he basically said that there will be support coming via a plugin for, I don't use that NLE, but it is called the Avid Media Composer. So that's good news. And apparently all of this is happening first quarter. So for the rest of the year, we are essentially stuck with what is. And as Canon develops their different training assets, they're going to be releasing them. But for the time being, we're left as a community to share amongst ourselves where we're seeing successes and where we're not seeing successes, so that we can then sort of move everyone forward while we're waiting for the rest of it to catch up. Got a question?
Ken for the Win said, on his use thus far, he thinks that it'll shine in the events and the indie commercial work. He can't wait to see how the other NLEs implement raw editing.
Sure. So this is two parts. Ken for the Win, thanks again for the question, or for the comment rather. I agree. I think that for event shooters, so people who are broadcasting or recording or redistributing maybe like press events or government events or conferences or symposiums or different things like that, I think that that camera comes in incredibly handy. And if you're an owner-operator and you own this camera, you now have 100% freedom to go after projects that require a raw workflow. That's a big opportunity to make a lot more money. We got another comment?
Ruger Production said raw, which I understand no sharpening or denoiser is applied, but the raw software does allow sharpening before processing. I did process the Clog 2, which does explain what you're saying.
C-Log 2, sure. Sure. Yeah, so there's a comment about how it was processed via C-Log 2, and you saw all the noise, and you're right, you can only sharpen, you cannot unsharpen. So the sharpening settings are set to 0 when you are shooting in C-Log, and that's true across all of the Canon cameras. I'm gonna just go out on a limb here, and I know that I'm the only one saying this right now, but if Canon says the C200 cannot shoot C-Log 2, even if they are capturing in RAW or RAW light, I would at this point have zero confidence in processing my RAW clips using C-Log 2, because my guess is the software has not been updated to allow for whatever magic needs to happen so that the raw light coming out of the C200 actually successfully shows up without all the extra artifacts and noise when you use C-Log 2 as the processing. We got another comment here.
Ken wants to know, what are your thoughts on the noise pattern for higher ISOs?
So Ken for the Win? Ken for the Win wants to know my thoughts on the higher ISO noise patterns. So I did not see any fixed pattern noise issues. The noise that begins to develop, in my opinion, after you go higher than ISO 6400 is organic. It's almost like film grain. Now, am I saying that I like that? No, but does it bother me? And the answer is no. Now, would I shoot higher than 6400? Only if I was, like if somebody's holding a gun to my head and I cannot light and they won't allow me to bring in any lights, then yes. But if you're able to bring in any lights whatsoever, ISO 6400 on the Canon sensors with the Canon image processing is over the top excellent. That's even true on the 5D Mark IV with C-Log. So that's my thought.
Stefan said that he did a test with the C200 clip. He shot outdoors, got some blown out highlights. He thought that the brightness slider was actually doing ISO adjustments until you said, I see that it can't be retained.
Yeah, that's right. If you blow out the if you are able to blow out the highlights, or you purposely blow out the highlights, and you bring it into the Canon RAW development software and you try to use the brightness adjustment to recover the blown highlights, you will not be able to. The Canon rep was very adamant about saying that whatever ISO settings we pick are baked into that raw light clip, and the brightness only basically changes the levels in the tonal curve, not the actual ISO or gain.
So Stefan said any of those highlights by dragging down, he continued what he said before, but I did find that switching Canon's C-Log2 did get back some of them, so at least he had a small win.
Sure. So again, for me, it's very difficult for me, at least on my experience at this point, with what it is that I've shot, to recommend that anybody process using C-Log2. And while C-Log2 has additional stops of latitude, right, which is what allows you to, if you did blow something out, to recover some of it, or if you did crush some shadows, to recover some of them, you're not, in my opinion, it's not worth it. I would rather expose right down the middle and process in C-Log3 or even YDR, and then make the rest of my adjustments in Resolve than risk adding the blocky noise and artifacts that I've seen when I process my clips using C-Log2.
So Stefan said, yeah, he was avoiding it based on some of the Carlos's earlier findings. He also preferred to stay in Resolve, but it's a good short saver if you need it.
Yeah, so that's really what I see today as the only drawback. So Stefan mentioned that he does prefer, like if you want to work quickly, going the Resolve route is not horrible. So that is true. If you're shooting RAW and you're going the Resolve route, it's not completely horrible, but the LUTs are not going to give you the maximum of what that image can be, because you have to make adjustments after you apply the LUT, right? If you are shooting a documentary or a short film or something that is going to be viewed on a screen larger than 60 inches, I will be the first person that recommends that you use the Canon RAW development software first to both assign a white balance and then also assign a color space and then assign a gamma that you want to work in, export that, and then in Resolve, apply your LUTs or do your final finishing for that image. Because everything begins to matter more the larger the screen, and that is a fact.
So a few comments. Ken for the win says C-Log2 has more dynamic range.
Absolutely. C-Log2 has way more dynamic range.
He says to Stefan that it'll only get better because he has a feeling that the raw light is going to be in the new Canon cinema cameras.
Canon always, from what I've seen, and I've been shooting Canon for a really long time at this point, when they introduce something, you're absolutely right. It only improves. It gets better because it begins to mature. And a lot of that maturity happens based on how people are using the product and then what the people are asking for. Now, does that mean that they're going to make any one of the older cameras, like the C200 Mark II, for example, that I bought a couple years back, are they going to allow me to shoot RAW internally with it? No. But they came out with another tool that made that available. And that maturity curve is something that I believe Canon continues to work towards. And I know they get a lot of flack for not being innovative or not releasing products fast enough. But the fact is that a lot of us who are in the industry and are working pros continue to buy their products for a reason. They flat out work, and they're gorgeous, and they're easy to work with, and they can handle the rigors of real productions.
Jeremy Gay, he said, hi Carlos and Bert. Sorry,
Hey Jeremy.
Sorry if the question was answered earlier. Can the C200 output 422 or 420?
422?
Yeah, 422 in 8-bit or 10-bit 4K to an external.
Sure. So Jeremy asked, can the Canon C200 export via HDMI 422, 8-bit or 10-bit? And the answer is yes, but not when you're shooting RAW. So if you're shooting RAW, the Canon C200 does not have the ability to output a 4K signal via the HDMI. If you're shooting MP4, then you are able to output 10-bit 4K 422 at 60p. And the only external recorder that I have experience with that has been able to actually successfully record that was the Atomos product. So the Atomos Shogun Inferno is the one that I used. If you have an SDI external recorder, the SDI is only able to output, regardless of how you're shooting in camera, it can only output 2K or 1080p. So if you're going to capture 4K on an external recorder, it has to be done through the HDMI. Well, guys, this was really cool that you guys were able to join me. I know it's Friday and it's right before a holiday here in the US. So if there are no other questions, I'm going to wrap it up. Be sure to check out the actual full phone call with the Canon rep that I'll be releasing and publishing sometime tomorrow. And have a great weekend. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to stop by. If you're visiting my channel, thanks for stopping by. Consider subscribing. And of course, I'd like to invite anyone who has not subscribed to subscribe so that we can keep this conversation going and continue to move each other forward. Again, really